The chapter what we are seeing is reproduction in plants and animals. Already we have discussed about the asexual reproduction and vegetative reproduction in plants. Today we can see about the sexual reproduction in plants. So what is sexual reproduction? It is the process in which two gametes were fused to produce offspring of their own kind. So two gametes, that is the male and the female gamete, that is the sperm and the egg, will fuse to produce the offspring of their own kind. As we are seeing the reproduction in plants, flower is the reproductive organ in plant and it is the modified form of stem, because here the tip of the stem will compress to form the flower. That is why this flower is the modified form of the stem or the shoot system. To study about the sexual reproduction in plants, we should know the parts of the flower, because flower is the reproductive organ in plant. This flower consists of four whorls and these four whorls are born on the thalamus. First, the outermost whorl is the sepals. All the sepals are together called as calyx, which is green in color and it protects the buds. Its role is protecting the buds. When the flower is in bud stage, these sepals will protect the buds. The next is the petals. The petals are together called as corolla, which is normally brightly colored for attracting the insects for pollination. That is petals. Next is the stamen, which consists of bag-like structure called the anther and a stalk-like structure called filament. All the stamens are together called as androecium, and that is the male reproductive part. The innermost layer is the carpel, which contains the stigma at the top. Normally it will be bulb-like structure. Then there will be a long style and a swollen ovary. And inside the ovary, the ovule will be present, in which the egg will form. And here the sepals and the petals are called the non-essential or accessory whorls, because it will not involve in reproduction, because the sepals are protecting the buds and the petals are, its role is attracting the insects, that is its role. But for reproduction, which is involving is androecium and the gynoecium, so they are called the essential whorls. As we are studying about the reproduction in plants, we are focusing on androecium and gynoecium. First is the androecium, and it is the male reproductive part of the flower. It contains anther and filament. The anther was covered by pollen grains, and these pollen grains will travel to reach the stigma of the flower. And these pollen grains are spherical in shape. It contains two layers, that are the outer is the hard exine and it contains the germ pore, and the inner layer is the thin intine, and this intine layer is made up of cellulose and pectin. The matured pollen grains will contain the generative cell and the vegetative cell. The generative cell contains the generative nucleus, and this generative cell will give rise to two sperms. Next is the gynoecium. It is the female reproductive part of the flower. It contains stigma at the top, then a long style and the swollen ovary. And inside the ovary it contains the ovule, and all these are together known as the carpel. Then all the carpels are together called the pistil or gynoecium, which is the female reproductive part of the flower. Here we can see the structure of the ovule. This ovule has two main parts, that is the stalk-like part, which is called the funicle, and the body part. The body part has layers for protection, and these layers are called the integuments. Then the basal part of the ovule is called the chalaza, and the end where the integuments are not joined or there is a tiny opening is called the micropyle. And inside the integuments it was filled with group of cells which is called as the nucellus. Then inside this nucellus embryo sac will be present, which contains 7 cells and 8 nucleus. In the 7 cells, 3 cells are present on near the chalasai end, that is the antipodal cells, and 3 cells are present near the micropylar end, and it will form into egg apparatus. So in the 3 cells, one cell will form into the egg cell, and the remaining two will form into synergids. And these synergids are short-lived cells, and it helps the nucleus of the pollen grains to reach the egg cell for fertilization. And the two nuclei will be present at the center of the embryo sac, which is called as the polar nuclei. The presence of 7 cells and 8 nucleus in the embryo sac is 3 cells are present on the chalasai end and 3 cells are present on the micropylar end. So 6 cells plus 1 is the embryo sac, that is the bigger cell. Then 8 nucleus is 6 cells are present on the micropylar end and the chalasai end, and these 6 cells contain 6 nucleus plus 2 nucleus is the in the center of the embryo sac there will be 2 nucleus are present, which is the polar nucleus. So 6 plus 2 is 8 nucleus which are present in the embryo sac. Up to now, we saw about the reproductive organ and the parts. So, there we saw that the pollen grains from the male reproductive organ will transfer to the stigma of the female reproductive organ of the flower. So, that process is the pollination, and this pollination is of two types. They are the self-pollination and cross-pollination. So after this pollination, fertilization will take place. First we can see about the pollination. So what is pollination? Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to stigma of a flower. So pollen grains is the male reproductive part and the stigma is the in the female reproductive part. So pollen grains has to transfer from anther to the stigma. So it is of two types, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is also called as autogamy. It means the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of same flower or another flower. That is, the pollen grains is to transfer from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. The plant should be same, but the flower can be same flower or another flower. Example of self-pollination is hibiscus. Then cross-pollination. Here, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another plant, but it should be on the same species. The species should be same, but the plant will be another. So that is the cross-pollination. It is found in plants like apples, grapes, plums, etc. So this is the pollination and its types. Now we can see the advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination and cross-pollination. The advantages of self-pollination is it is possible in bisexual flower, that is both the male and female gametes will be present in the same flower. Because of that, it is not depending on any other agents for pollination and there is no wastage of pollen grains. That is the advantages of self-pollination. Then the advantages of cross-pollination is it will produce new variety of plants. As the pollen grains are transferring from one plant to another plant in cross-pollination, it will produce new variety of plants and more viable seeds are also produced in the cross-pollination. That is the advantages. Then the disadvantages are in self-pollination, seeds are less in number. In hibiscus plants, we know the seeds will be very less in number, and if the seeds are producing any plants, means that plants will be very weak. And new variety of plants cannot be produced. Only same plants will be produced. New variety of plants cannot be produced in self-pollination. And the disadvantages of cross-pollination is pollination may fail due to distance barrier because the pollen grain is transferring from one plant to another plant. So there is distance will be there. Because of that, pollination may fail. And many wastage of pollen grains. More pollen grains will get waste because of this cross pollination, and also may introduce unwanted characters, and also it will always depend on external agencies for pollination. So now we can see what are the agents are essential for this pollination. What are the agents which are involved in pollination? The agents of pollination are wind, insects, water, animals. So if the pollination is done by wind, it is called the anemophily. And if the pollination is done with the help of insect, it is known as entomophily. And if the pollination occurred by water, it is known as hydrophily. And if the pollination is through animals, it is known as zoophily. So the pollination of wind is also known as anemophily. Here the flower will produce more pollen grains, and the pollen grains are dry, smooth, small, and it was light in weight, and its weight is very light. And here the pollens can travel to a distance of 1000 kilometers. So here the pollen grains will travel to a distance up to 1000 kilometers, and the stigmas are long and hairy. So the pollen grains will come and attach to the stigmas. So the stigmas will be very long and hairy for the trapping of the pollen grains, and the examples are grasses and cacti. And next is the pollination by insects. So it is also called the entomophily. Here the flowers are brightly colored. So if the flowers are brightly colored, then the insects can able to attract very soon. So these flowers can attract the insects soon, and the pollen grains will be very large and spiny for sticking firmly on the stigma. So for sticking firmly on the stigma, here the pollen grains will be larger and spiny, and 80% of the pollination by insects is occurred through the honeybees. Honeybees are involved in the pollination by insects. Then next is the pollination of water. So if the pollination occurs through water, it is known as hydrophily. Here the pollen grains will be large in number, and the pollen grains will float on the surface of water till they reach the stigmas of the female flower. So the pollen grains will be float on the water, and then it will reach the stigma of the flower for fertilization. And the examples are hydrilla and vallisneria. These are the examples of hydrophily. Then next is the pollination by animals. So if the pollination is done by animals, it is known as the zoophily. Here the flowers are brightly colored, and the size and the scent was also nice for attracting the animals. And the sunbird helps in the pollination of the plants like canna and gladioli. And the squirrel helps in the pollination in silk cotton tree. Silk cotton tree. So these are all the agents which are involved in pollination. So after this pollination, fertilization will take place. We can see about this here. Because of pollination, the pollen grains reaches the stigma, and we studied that the outer surface of the pollen grain contain the jampore, and this jampore will form an pollen tube at the stigma, and this pollen tube will extend towards the style, and it finally reaches the embryo sac through the micropyle. And we also studied that the pollen grain contains the vegetative cell and the generative cell. Here the vegetative cell will start to degenerate, and the generative cell will divide into two sperms. So when this pollen tube reaches the embryo sac, the pollen tube will burst, and the sperms which are present inside will enter into the embryo sac. Also, we studied that the embryo sac contains three cells at the micropylar end. In that three cell, one is the egg cell and two is the synergids. So now we are studying that two sperms will enter inside the embryo sac through the micropylar end. In that two sperm, one will fuse with the egg cell to form the diploid zygote, and that process is the fertilization, which is also known as syngamy. And now one sperm is there, one more sperm. That sperm will fuse with the polar nuclei. That is, two nucleus will present at the center of the embryo sac. So one sperm will fuse with two nucleus to form the primary endosperm nucleus, and this process is known as triple fusion because one sperm and two nucleus is getting fused. So here the fertilization and also the triple fusion is taking place. Hence this process is called the double fertilization. So After this fertilization, the primary endosperm will develop into the endosperm. So, endosperm is the materials which are present inside the seed. So, for example, in coconut, we can say that white part and the liquid as the endosperm. And this endosperm will provide food to the embryo. And after this nerves and the antipodal cells will start to degenerate. So these are all the things which will happen when the sperm enter inside the embryo sac. Next we can see the significance of fertilization, that is the importance of fertilization. Here, because of this fertilization, the seed and fruit was developed, and after that here the different individuals get fused to form the new character, new individual. And after this fertilization, what are the changes that will take place? That is the post fertilization changes. So ovules which are present will develops into the seed, and the integuments will develop into the seed coat, and the ovary will enlarges and it will develops into the fruit. So these are all the changes that happens after fertilization. These all are about the reproduction in plants. In the next video, we can see the reproduction in animals.